Welcome to Major Intonio's presentation of The Reality of War, A Companion to Clausewitz, by Stewart L. Murray. Editor's Preface.
Great books, the masterpieces of the special branch of knowledge with which they deal, are often very big books, and busy men who have not unlimited time for reading find it helpful to have someone who will give them a general summary of a famous writer's teaching and point out the most important passages in which the author himself embodies the very essence of his argument. This is what Major Murray has done for the most important work on war that was ever written. He does not give a mere dry summary of its contents. He sets forth, in language so plain that even the civilian reader or the youngest soldier can read it with interest, the essence of the teaching of Clausewitz, and he embodies in his book the most striking passages of the original work. He adds to each section of his subject some useful criticisms, and at the end of the book, he sums up the effect of recent changes on the practice of war. The book is a popular manual of the realities of war, which should be read not only by soldiers, but by everyone who takes an intelligent interest in the great events of our time. As to the practical value of the writings of Clausewitz, it may be well to quote here the words of Mr. Spencer Wilkinson, the professor of military history at Oxford, from his introduction to the original edition of Major Murray's work. Clausewitz was a Prussian officer who first saw fighting as a boy in 1793 and whose experience of war lasted until 1815, when the Great War ended. He was then 35 and spent the next 15 years in trying to clear his mind on the subject of war, which he did by writing a number of military histories and a systematic treatise on war. At the age of 50, he tied his manuscripts into a parcel, hoping to work at them again on the conclusion of the duties for which he was ordered from home. A little more than a year later, he died at Breslau of cholera, and the papers, to which he had never put the finishing touch, were afterwards published by his widow. Part of the value of his work is due to the exceptional opportunities which he enjoyed. When the War of 1806 began, he had long been the personal adjutant of one of the Prussian princes, and an intimate friend of Scharnhorst, who was probably the greatest of Napoleon's contemporaries. In the period of reorganization which followed the Peace of Tilsit, he made the acquaintance of Gneisenau and of almost all the officers who made their mark in the subsequent wars of liberation. During the years of preparation, he was Scharnhorst's assistant, first in the Ministry of War and then on the General Staff. During the campaign of 1812, he served with the Russian army as a staff officer. Thus, his experience during the 4 years of the Wars of Liberation was that of one who was continually behind the scenes, always in touch with the governments and generals, and therefore better able than anyone not so favorably placed to see everything in its proper perspective, and to follow and appreciate the considerations which directed the decisions both of statesmen and of the commanders of armies. His personal character was of the finest mold, and his writings have the sincerity, the absence of which makes it so difficult to rely upon those of Napoleon. The ultimate test of the value of books is time. When Clausewitz died, the 2 books on war, which were thought the best, were those of the Archduke Charles of Austria and General Jomini. Today, the book of Clausewitz, on war, easily holds the first place. It is the least technical of all the great books on war. From beginning to end, it is nothing but common sense applied to the subject, but for that reason it is the hardest to digest, because common sense, or a man's natural instinctive judgment on any subject, is exceedingly hard to analyze and put into words. An exceptionally gifted man can go through this process, but few can follow it for any length of time without a distinct effort. Almost every good institution has arisen out of the effort to provide a remedy for some evil, but in the imperfection of human nature, nearly every institution brings with it fresh evils, which in their turn have to be counteracted. The modern spirit, with its hatred of nepotism and its belief in knowledge, has grafted the examination system upon every form of education, from the lowest to the highest. The British Army shares in the benefits and in the disadvantages of the system, of which, in the case of an officer, the danger to be guarded against is that it tends to accustom a man to rely rather on his memory than his intelligence, and to lean more on other people's thinking than on his own. Clausewitz aimed at producing the very opposite result. He does not offer specific solutions of the various problems of war, lest officers, in moments when their business is to decide and to act, should be trying to recall his precepts instead of using their eyes and their wits. His purpose, rather, is to enable them to understand what war is. He believed that if a man had accustomed himself to think of war as it really is, had got to know the different elements which go to make it up, and to distinguish those that are important from those that are comparative trifles, he would be more likely to know of himself what to do in a given situation, and would be much less likely to confuse himself by trying to remember what some general, long since dead, did on some occasion in which, after all, the position was by no means the same as that in which he finds himself. What is said here of the soldier actually engaged in war is true also even of the onlooker who takes a patriotic interest in the progress of a war in which his country is involved. Unless he has a clear idea of the real character of modern war and the principles on which success or failure depend, he will be utterly unable to grasp the significance of the events of which he reads each day. And it is of real importance that in time of war, every citizen should judge soundly the course of events, for opinion influences action, and public opinion is made up of the ideas of the units who compose the public. In this connection, it is well to bear in mind a point that is often overlooked, a point on which Clausewitz insists in a singularly convincing passage, namely, the fact that one of the main objects of a nation waging war is to force the enemy's population into a state of mind favorable to submission. This fact is sufficient proof of the importance of public opinion being well informed not only as to the course of events, but also as to the principles that give to these events their real significance.
Chapter 1. The Life of Clausewitz.
In an endeavor, such as the present, to interest the British public in even the greatest military writer, the first necessity is to show that he was not a mere theorist or bookworm. The wide and varied experience which the British officer gradually gains in so many different parts of the world shows up the weak points of most theories and produces a certain distrust of them. Also, a distrust of theory is undoubtedly one of our national characteristics. Hence, in order to appeal to the British officer or civilian, a writer must be a practical soldier. Such was General Clausewitz, a practical soldier of very great experience in the long series of wars 1793 to 1815, and one present throughout that most awful of all campaigns, Napoleon's Russian campaign in 1812. General Karl von Clausewitz was born near Magdeburg in 1780 and entered the Prussian army as Fahnenjunker in 1792. He served in the campaigns of 1793 to 1794 on the Rhine. In 1801, he entered the military school at Berlin as an officer and remained there till 1803. He here attracted the notice of Scharnhorst. In the campaign of 1806, he served as aide-de-camp to Prince Augustus of Prussia, was present at the Battle of Jena, and saw that awful retreat which ended a fortnight later in the surrender at Prenzlau. Being wounded and captured, he was sent into France as a prisoner till the end of the war. On his return in November 1807, he was placed on General Scharnhorst's staff and employed on the work then going on for the reorganization of the Prussian army. In 1812, Clausewitz entered the Russian service, was employed on the general staff, and was thus able to gain much experience in the most gigantic of all the struggles of his time. In the spring campaign of 1813, battles of Lutzen, Bautzen, etc., he, as a Russian officer, was attached to Blücher's staff. During the winter campaign, he found employment as chief of the staff to Count Walmoden, who fought against De Vast on the lower Elbe, and the splendid action of the Gord was entirely the result of his able dispositions. In 1815, he again entered the Prussian service and was chief of the staff to the 3rd Army Corps, Thielmann, which at Ligny formed the left of the line of battle and at Wavre covered the rear of Blücher's army. In addition to this, we may say considerable practical training. Note, enormous and varied indeed compared to any obtainable in the present day, he also possessed a comprehensive and thorough knowledge of military history and also an uncommonly clear perception of general history, von Kemmerer. After the peace, he was employed in a command on the Rhine. In 1818, he became Major General and was made director of the military school at Berlin. Here he remained for some years. This was the chief period of his writings. As General von Kemmerer, in his Development of Strategical Science, puts it, this practical and experienced, and at the same time highly cultured soldier feels now in peaceful repose, as he himself confesses, the urgent need to develop and systematize the whole world of thought which occupies him, yet also resolves to keep secret till his death the fruit of his researches, in order that his soul, which is thirsting for truth, may be safely and finally spared all temptations from subordinate considerations. In 1830 he was appointed Director of Artillery at Breslau, and having no more time for writing, sealed up and put away his papers, unfinished as they were. In the same year he was appointed Chief of the Staff to Field Marshal Gneisenau's army. In the winter of that year, war with France was considered imminent, and Clausewitz had prospects of acting as Chief of the General Staff of the Commander-in-Chief Gneisenau. He then drew up two plans for war with France, which bear the stamp of that practical knowledge of war and adaptation of means to ends which distinguish his writings. In the same year the war scare passed away, the army of Gneisenau was disbanded, and Clausewitz returned to Breslau, where after a few days he was seized with cholera and died in November 1831, aged only 51. His works were published after his death by his widow.
Chapter 2. The Influence of Clausewitz on Modern Policy and War.
From the day of their publication until now, the influence of the writings of Clausewitz has been steadily growing. Till today it is impossible to overestimate the extent of that influence upon modern military and political thought, especially in Germany. As General von Kemmerer, in his Development of Strategical Science, says, Karl von Clausewitz, the pupil and friend of Scharnhorst and the confidant of Gneisenau, is in Germany generally recognized as the most prominent theorist on war, as the real philosopher on war, to whom our famous victors on the more modern battlefields owe their spiritual training. Field Marshal Moltke was his most distinguished pupil and adapted the teaching of Clausewitz to the conditions of today. General von der Goltz, in the introduction to his great work, The Nation in Arms, thus describes the veneration which he inspires. A military writer who, after Clausewitz, writes upon the subject of war, runs the risk of being likened to a poet who, after Goethe, attempts a Faust, or after Shakespeare, a Hamlet. Everything important that can be told about the nature of war can be found stereotyped in the works which that great military genius has left behind him. Although Clausewitz has himself described his book as being something as yet incomplete, this remark of his must be taken to mean that he, too, was subject to the fate of all aspiring spirits, and was forced to feel that all he attained lay far beneath his ideal. For us, who knew not what that ideal was, his labors are a complete work. I have, accordingly, not attempted to write anything new or of universal applicability about the science of warfare, but have limited myself to turning my attention to the military operations of our own day. One can hardly imagine a stronger tribute of admiration. And, as Moltke was Clausewitz's most distinguished pupil, so also are all those trained in the school of Moltke pupils of Clausewitz, including the most eminent of modern German military writers, such as General von Blum in his Strategy, von der Goltz in his Nation in Arms and the Conduct of War, who trained the Turkish General Staff for the campaign of 1897 against Greece and the Battle of Pharsalia, etc., General von Boguslawski, General von Verdi du Vernois, the father of the study of applied tactics, General von Schlichting in his Tactical and Strategical Principles of the Present, General Meckel, who trained the Japanese staff, etc., etc. We all remember the telegram sent to General Meckel by Marshal Oyama after the Battle of Liaoyang. We hope you are proud of your pupils. Some time ago, when asked to give a lecture at Aldershot to the officers of the 2nd Division on Clausewitz, it struck me that it would be very interesting, anxious as we all were then to know the causes of the wonderful Japanese efficiency and success, if I could obtain a pronouncement from General Meckel how far he had been influenced in his teaching by Clausewitz. My friend Herr von Donet did me the favor to write to General von Kemmerer and ask him if he could procure me such a pronouncement which I might publish. General Meckel, whose death both Japan and Germany have since had to mourn, most kindly consented, and I esteem it a great honor to be allowed to quote part of his letter. He said, I, like every other German officer, have, consciously or unconsciously, instructed in the spirit of Clausewitz. Clausewitz is the founder of that theory of war which resulted from the Napoleonic. I maintain that everyone who nowadays either makes or teaches war in a modern sense bases himself upon Clausewitz, even if he is not conscious of it. This opinion of General Meckel, to whose training of the Japanese General Staff the success of the Japanese armies must be largely attributed, is most interesting. It is not possible to give a stronger or more up-to-date example of the magnitude of the influence of Clausewitz. In this connection, I should like to make a short quotation from The War in the Far East by the Times military correspondent. In his short but suggestive chapter on Clausewitz in Manchuria, he says, "But as all save one of the great battles in Manchuria have been waged by the Japanese in close accordance with the spirit and almost the letter of Clausewitz's doctrine, and as the same battles have been fought by the Russians in absolute disregard of them, though his works had been translated into Russian by General Dragomirov long before the war, it is certainly worth showing how reading and reflection may profit one army, and how the neglect of this respectable practice may ruin another." Clausewitz in Manchuria. That brings us up to date. It is a far cry for his influence to have reached and triumphed. Reflections. Clausewitz wrote his book expressly for statesmen as well as soldiers. We may be sure, therefore, that the influence of Clausewitz on the continent has penetrated the realm of policy little less widely than the realm of war. From this thought arise many reflections. It will be sufficient here to suggest one. I would suggest that we should regard every foreign statesman, especially in Germany, as consciously or unconsciously a disciple of Clausewitz. That is to say, we should regard him as a man who, underneath everything else, underneath the most pacific assurances for the present, considers war an unalterable part of policy. He will regard war as part of the ordinary intercourse of nations, and occasional warlike struggles as inevitable as commercial struggles. He will consider war also as an instrument of policy, which he himself may have to use, and to be studied accordingly. He will consider it not as a thing merely for speeches, but for practical use in furthering or defending the interests of his state. He will regard war as the means by which someday his nation shall impose its will upon another nation. He will be prepared to wait, to make every imaginable preparation, and finally to let loose war in its most absolute and ruthless character, war carried out with the utmost means, the utmost energy, and the utmost effort of a whole nation in arms, determined to achieve its political object and compel submission to its will by force. To talk to such a man of the evils of war, or of the burden of armaments, or to propose to him disarmament or reduction of armed forces, and so forth, can only appear to him as the result of imperfect knowledge. He will not say so, but he will think so, and act accordingly. To the partially instructed opponent of such a man, one can only say, "Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall."
Chapter 3. The Writings of Clausewitz.
The Writings of Clausewitz are contained in 9 volumes, published after his death in 1831, but his fame rests chiefly on his 3 volumes on war, which have been translated by Colonel J. J. Graham, the last edition edited by Colonel F. N. Maud, and published by Messrs. Kegan Paul, London. Clausewitz calls them a collection of materials, a mass of conceptions not brought into form, and states that he intended to revise and throw the whole into more complete shape. We must lament that he did not live to complete his revision. But on the other hand, it is perhaps possible that this unfinished state is really an advantage, for it leaves us free to apply his great maxims and principles and mode of thought to the ever-varying conditions of the present and future, unhampered by too complete a crystallization of his ideas written before more modern conditions of railways, telegraphs, and rapid long-ranging arms of precision, etc., arose. It is perhaps this unfinished state which renders Clausewitz so essentially in touch with and a part of the onward movement and evolution of military thought. For his great aim was the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, without preconception or favor, as far as he could go, essentially a realist of war. And what better aim can we set before ourselves? As Sir Arthur Helps has so well put it in his Friends in Council, every man needs a sort of central stem for his reading and culture. I wish here to say why I think that Clausewitz is admirably adapted to form such a main stem in the military culture of British officers. In the first place, there is a lofty sort of tone about his writings which one gradually realizes as one reads them, and which I will not attempt to describe further than by saying that they stamp themselves as the writings of a gentleman of fine character. In the second place, it is a book which any fellow can read, for there is nothing to put one off, nothing abstruse or mathematical or formal, no formulae or lines and angles and technical terms, such as in other writers, Jomini, Hamley, etc. Clausewitz is free from all such pedantries, which for my part, and I dare say for the part of many others, often put one off a book and made one instinctively feel that there was something wrong, something unpractical about it, which rendered it hardly worth the sacrifice of time involved in its study. There is in Clausewitz nothing of that kind at all. All those lines and angles and formulae he dismisses in a few pages as of little practical importance. In the third place, Clausewitz only goes in for experience and the practical facts of war. As he somewhat poetically puts it, the flowers of speculation require to be cut down low near the ground of experience, their proper soil. He is the great apostle of human nature and character as being everything in war. All war supposes human weakness, and against that it is directed. I believe that the British officer will find himself in sympathy with the great thinker on war, who asserts that, of all military virtues, energy in the conduct of operations has always conduced most to glory and success of arms. In the fourth place, to the practical mind will appeal his denunciation of all elaborate plans, because time is required for all elaborate combinations, and time is just the one thing that an active enemy will not give us, and his consequent deduction that all plans must be of the simplest possible form. His famous sentence, "In war all things are simple, but the simple are difficult," gives the key to his writings, for to overcome those simple yet great difficulties he regards as the art of war, which can only be done by the military virtues of perseverance, energy, and boldness. In the fifth place, he does not want men to be bookworms, for he says, "Theory is nothing but rational reflection upon all the situations in which we can be placed in war." And we can all reflect without reading too many books. Also, he says, much reading of history is not required for the above object. The knowledge of a few separate battles in their details is more useful than a general knowledge of several campaigns. On this account, it is more useful to read detailed narratives and journals than regular works of history. He wants history in detail, not a general smattering and a loose application thereof, which fault he strongly denounces. And he expressly states that the history of the very latest war is the most useful, all of which is very practical and in accord with what we feel to be true. As he pictures war, the struggle between the spiritual and moral forces on both sides is the center of all, and to this aspect of the subject he gives much more attention than Jomini and most of Jomini's disciples. He has freed us once for all from all formalism. The formation of character, careful, practical, detailed study, and thorough preparation in peace, the simplest plans carried out with the utmost perseverance, resolution, energy, and boldness in war. These are the practical fruits of his teaching. Therefore, I say again, that I do not think that the British officer could possibly find a more interesting or a better guide for the main stem of his reading than Clausewitz, nor any one that will appeal to his practical instincts of what is true half so well. I do not believe that he could possibly do better than with Clausewitz as main stem, and a detailed study of the latest campaigns and modern technicalities as the up-to-date edition required to transform knowledge into action. I trust that every reader of Clausewitz will agree with me in this.
Chapter 4: The Theory and the Practice of War.
Moltke, the most gifted pupil of Clausewitz. Moltke, who knew Clausewitz's book well, and often liked to describe him as the theoretical instructor. As Chaucer would say, "What needeth words more?" Clausewitz has treated practically every chief branch of strategy and tactics, except, of course, the present-day developments of railways, telegraphs, quick-firing guns, smokeless powder, universal service armies, etc. The whole of his bulky work, On War, is full of interesting and sometimes eloquent and almost poetical passages, of concentrated, pregnant, and far-reaching thoughts on every subject. Through all these, it is, of course, impossible to follow him in any introduction. One can really do no more than urge all to read Clausewitz for themselves, to go to the fountainhead, to the masterwork itself. In the short space to which I have restricted myself, I propose, therefore, to concentrate on a few of his leading ideas, reluctantly leaving out many others, which are really almost just as good. Theory and practice. One of the things for which we are most deeply indebted to Clausewitz is that he has shown us clearly the proper place of theory in relation to practice. It should educate the mind of the future leader in war, or rather guide him in his self-instruction, but not accompany him onto the battlefield. Just as a sensible tutor forms and enlightens the opening mind of a youth, without therefore keeping him in leading strings all his life. Again, in real action, most men are guided by the tact of judgment, which hits the object more or less accurately, according as they possess more or less genius. This is the way in which all great generals have acted, and therein partly lay their greatness and their genius, in that they always hit upon what was right by this tact. Thus also it will always be in action, and so far this tact is amply sufficient. But when it is a question not of acting oneself, but of convincing others in consultation, then all depends upon clear conceptions and demonstrations and the inherent relations. And so little progress has been made in this respect that most deliberations are merely a contention of words, resting on no firm basis, and ending either in every one retaining his own opinion, or in a compromise from mutual considerations of respect, a middle course really without any value. Clear ideas on these matters are not, therefore, wholly useless. How true this is, anyone will admit who reflects for a moment upon the great diversity of opinions on almost every subject held in our army, just because of this want of a central theory common to all. In the domain of tactics, it is evident that this holds good even as in strategy, for a common central theory of war will produce a more or less common way of looking at things, from which results more or less common action towards the attainment of the common object. Rejection of set and geometrical theories. It should educate the mind of the future leader in war, is what Clausewitz demands from a useful theory, but he most expressly and unreservedly rejects every attempt at a method by which definite plans for wars or campaigns are to be given out already made as if from a machine. He mocks at Bülow's including at first in the one-term base all sorts of things, like the supply of the army, its reinforcements and equipments, the security of its communications with the home country, and lastly, the security of its line of retreat, and then fixing the extent of the base, and finally fixing an angle for the extent of that base. And all this was done merely to obtain a pure geometrical result utterly useless, von Kemmerer. For the same reason, Jomini's principle of the inner line does not satisfy him, owing to its mere geometrical nature, although he right willingly acknowledges that it rests on a sound foundation, on the truth that the combat is the only effectual means in war, von Kemmerer. All such attempts at theory seem to him therefore perfectly useless, because they strive to work with fixed quantities, while in war everything is uncertain, and all considerations must reckon with all kinds of variable quantities, because they only consider material objects, while every action in war is saturated with moral forces and effects. Lastly, because they deal only with the action of one party, while war is a constant reciprocal effect of both parties. Von Kemmerer. Pity the warrior, says Clausewitz, who is contented to crawl about in this beggardom of rules. Pity the theory which sets itself in opposition to the mind, note the moral forces. a theory to be practically useful, Clausewitz insists that a useful theory cannot be more than a thorough knowledge of military history and reflection upon all the situations in which we can be placed in war. What genius does must be just the best of all rules, and theory cannot do better than to show just how and why it is so. It is an analytical investigation of the subject which leads to exact knowledge, and if brought to bear on the results of experience, which in our case would be military history, to a thorough familiarity with it. If theory investigates the subjects which constitute war, if it separates more distinctly that which at first sight seems amalgamated, if it explains fully the properties of the means, if it shows their probable effects, if it makes evident the nature of objects, if it brings to bear all over the field of war the light of essentially critical investigation, then it has fulfilled the chief duties of its province. It becomes then a guide to him who wishes to make himself acquainted with war from books. It lights up the whole road for him, facilitates his progress, educates his judgment, and shields him from error. Knowledge must be thorough. This Clausewitz considers most important. He says that knowledge of the conduct of war must pass completely into the mind and almost cease to be something objective. For in war, the moral reaction, the ever-changing form of things, makes it necessary for the chief actor to carry in himself the whole mental apparatus of his knowledge, in order that anywhere and at every pulse beat he may be capable of giving the requisite decision from himself. Knowledge must, by this complete assimilation with his own mind and life, be converted into real power. So much for Clausewitz, therefore, as the greatest yet the simplest and least theoretical of theorists on war. Mark well his comforting dictum that theory is nothing but rational reflection upon all the situations in which we can be placed in war. That is a task which we have all more or less attempted. Therefore, we are all more or less theorists. The only question is that of comparative thoroughness in our reflections. And it is essentially this thoroughness in investigation and reflection towards which Clausewitz helps us. Like every other habit, the habit of military reflection gradually grows with use, till, fortified and strengthened by detailed knowledge, it gradually becomes power. Reflections. The theory of war is simple, and there is no reason why any man who chooses to take the trouble to read and reflect carefully on one or two of the acknowledged best books thereon should not attain to a fair knowledge thereof. He may with reasonable trouble attain to such knowledge of the theory of war as will enable him to follow with intelligent appreciation the discussions of experienced soldier or soldiers. Such knowledge as will prevent his misunderstanding the experienced soldier's argument from pure ignorance, and such knowledge as will enable him to understand the military reasons put forward and the military object proposed. To the opinion of such a man all respect will be due. Thus and thus only. It is indeed the plain duty of all who aspire to rule, either thus to qualify themselves to understand, or else to abstain from interference with, the military interests of the state.
This concludes Chapter 4 of The Reality of War by Stewart Murray, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also tomorrow for Chapters 5 to 8. If you want to download the complete audiobook, visit our web shop at www.payhip.com/Intonio. Thank you for listening, and so long.